Let's talk about a former NFL wide receiver. This wide receiver currently ranks 10th on the all-time receptions list, and also 10th on the all-time receiving yards list. When he retired, he was a few spots further up each list, and he was also inside the top 5 of playoff catches and yards. That's because this receiver was a key cog in one of the great offenses of all time, producing Pro Bowl caliber numbers for about a decade and winning a Super Bowl. He was durable, the only receiver in football to start every game from 2004 all the way to 2010. Unlike some other outspoken wideouts of his time, this receiver was loved by his teammates, his coaches, his fans, and the media every step of the way. Sounds like a Hall of Famer? You're not alone in that thought. This wide receiver is Indianapolis Colts hero, Reggie Wayne. Let's talk about another receiver. This one didn't play quite as long as Wayne, and so ranks a few ticks behind him on the all-time receptions and yards list. This receiver also didn't have the benefit of playing on as many playoff teams, although also won a Super Bowl. But in the 11 years he did play, this player broke the NFL records for catches and receiving yards in any decade, posted 2 1,600-yard seasons, which Wayne never did once, was a 7-time Pro Bowler, and for good measure is just as loved and respected around the game as Wayne. This is Rams legend Torry Holt, who's been on the Hall of Fame ballot alongside Wayne for several years now. Full disclosure, as a kid growing up in the 2000s watching sports, I totally fell in love with the Colts. To me, they were the most entertaining team in the league. In 2004, they scored well over 500 points while Peyton broke the touchdowns record. In both 2005 and 2009, they came very close to finishing the regular season undefeated. And the 2006 Colts won the Super Bowl. They were the antithesis to the evil, cheating, dynastic Patriots and had a likable coach, multiple Hall of Famers on offense, and a dominant pass rush anchoring a bend-but-no-break defense. It was an amazing formula, and so for years, despite never having been to the Midwest, I called myself a Colts fan. All the players are gone, and eventually I grew closer to my local team, but thanks to that era of football, I still have a little fondness for the Colts even today. And somewhere along the line, Reggie Wayne became my favorite. He's one of a very small select group of athletes whose jersey I own. Even as a kid, I always preferred team memorabilia to player-specific stuff because I recognized that individual players were humans who might let me down one day. But Reggie was a rare exception, and when he retired, I shared the view of all Colts sympathizers that he was absolutely worthy of the Hall of Fame. And I still think that's probably true. But, so far, the Pro Football Hall of Fame Selection Committee hasn't called his name, and the more time that passes, the more I understand why. Let's first talk about Reggie Wayne specifically before talking about the wide receiver position in general. Seeing as I've laid out a decent case in his favor, I think it's only fair to play devil's advocate and make some counter-arguments. The most obvious problem on Reggie Wayne's resume is that while he was maybe the 5th best receiver for probably 7 or 8 years in a row, there was never a moment when he was considered the very best. One reason for this is a lack of black type. The only major category in which Reggie Wayne ever led the league was receiving yards once in 2007. He wasn't far off the receiving lead in 2010, but finished a few catches short of Roddy White and Brandon Lloyd. On his Football Reference profile, there are 2 other bold-faced numbers in the obscure category of yards per touch. But to qualify for the leaderboard, the site requires a minimum 6.25 touches per game, which means that several of the real big play names in the NFL at the time, most notably Deshaun Jackson, don't show up ahead of Wayne. For someone with so many catches playing on such a great team for so long, Reggie Wayne didn't score as many touchdowns as you might expect. He's only 27th on the leaderboard. I can think of 2 reasons for this, one of which has nothing to do with Wayne, and one of which kinda does. The first is that the Colts had plenty of other weapons and never needed to force Wayne the ball. In his early years, it was Marvin Harrison and Edgerrin James. Later, it was Dallas Clark and bits of Pierre Garçon and even T.Y. Hilton. The second reason, though, is that while Wayne was known as a very savvy receiver and a phenomenal route runner, he did not have as big a frame as many of his contemporaries who might have been better targets for contested end zone catches. So then we might say, okay, maybe Wayne wasn't the most physically dominant receiver, and maybe he didn't have much black type, but his trump card is his role in the history of the game. Wayne's playoff statistics put him in some rarefied air, as one of the only players in history with 90 postseason catches and 1,200 yards. But, and it's totally sacrilegious for me to say this, Wayne's career playoff totals overstate his per-game impact. Wayne played in 21 total playoff games and averaged under 60 yards. Torry Holt did better than that, and Julian Edelman's playoff stat line blows Wayne's out of the water. Very few receivers have played in as many playoff games over as many different seasons as Reggie Wayne did. To post that many catches and yards is impressive, but very much a reflection of opportunity. Okay, I don't know what came over me just now. Let's again make the case in favor. Reggie Wayne's career statistical totals compare very favorably with inducted Hall of Fame receivers. Actually, I think Wayne clearly has the most impressive career stat line of any receiver not in the Hall of Fame, with the exceptions of the still active Larry Fitzgerald and possibly AB or Julio. Many years ago, sabermetrician Bill James devised a Hall of Fame monitor in an attempt to predict which players would one day be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. The Sports Reference site has its own formula for football and gives Wayne the highest score of any eligible receiver, actually above the average for even the already inducted players. But there are a couple huge caveats to this list. The first is that if you scroll down a bit all the way into the 80s, you find Calvin Johnson. In theory, this formula says a score of 100 designates the average modern era inductee, but Calvin isn't close to 100. Yet Calvin, unlike Chris Carter, Terrell Owens, and even Marvin Harrison, was inducted into the Hall of Fame on his very first ballot last year. He didn't quite check all the longevity-based statistical boxes, but instead posted 3 consecutive first-team All-Pro seasons, broke the single-season receiving record, and peaked as clearly the best receiver in the NFL in the early 2010s. If Calvin had wanted to, and if he had stayed healthy, he could certainly have passed Reggie's stats in every regular season category. But playing for Detroit, suffering concussions and other injuries, and losing interest in the game, he walked away at 30. His case shows us that the Hall of Fame cares about dominance and peak performance more than it cares about consistency and longevity. I don't personally take issue with that, but that is a mild problem for Reggie Wayne. The second caveat is this. Among the top 20 receivers according to this silly formula, 14 played at least some of their careers in the 21st century, and another, Michael Irvin, retired after 1999. A lot of receivers today are able to achieve numbers that would previously have made them shoo-ins for the Hall of Fame, but in today's pass-happy environment, they don't stand out from their peers. Clearly, this conundrum is only going to become worse as the NFL has added a 17th game to the schedule, teams run more plays and throw more passes per game, point totals continue going up, etc. This problem, and the Hall of Fame receiver logjam it has created, is going to be the primary focus of this video. Torry Holt became eligible for the Hall of Fame ballot in 2015, the same year as his longtime Rams teammate Isaac Bruce. Like Wayne and Harrison in Indianapolis, we have 2 teammates at the wide receiver position who played on the same great offense and each finished with Hall-caliber numbers. Longtime receiver teammates have been inducted once before, Lynn Swann and John Stallworth on the 70s Steelers, but it's still a difficult thing for the selection committee to wrap their heads around. Since we think of a Hall of Fame receiver as dominant and alpha, to use a fantasy term, there's always going to be a reluctance to accept that some teams could be fortunate enough to have 2. Holt and Bruce, who finished their careers with very similar statistics, were joined by Tim Brown and Marvin on that 2015 vote. The Pro Football Hall of Fame has a tiered system where you have finalists and semifinalists. Long story short, Brown got inducted, Harrison was a finalist, Holt and Bruce both had to wait. The next year, Terrell Owens showed up on the ballot, and he was instantly a finalist, but for whatever reason didn't get inducted, while Harrison got in and Holt and Bruce had to wait as semifinalists again. In 2017, no receivers were inducted, and it was Owens and Bruce as finalists. They were joined by Randy Moss in 2018, who got inducted on his first ballot, and the voters finally got the memo to induct Owens as well. I could go on, but you can see the problem here. There are too many of these guys for the voters to sift through at once, particularly when there are a lot of other positions and players to consider. In 2020, Isaac Bruce was finally inducted, perhaps paving the way for these guys in the future. Was Isaac Bruce actually a stronger candidate than Holt? I really don't know. It's damn close, and the stupid formula actually has Holt a bit ahead. The blog Sports Head to Head did an article about this and also concluded that Holt was the more worthy receiver, and that since Isaac Bruce has been inducted, Holt should be as well. To oversimplify a ton, I view Torry Holt's candidacy as a sort of middle ground between a true peak value case like Calvin and a steady longevity play like Reggie, in the sense that Holt's career was shorter and he had a bit more black type, but also wasn't quite in that very tip-top group of early 2000s receivers, Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, and Marvin Harrison. Wayne, Holt, Bruce, and 2 other guys we're going to talk about formed the second tier, guys who absolutely achieved Hall of Fame-worthy stats in comparison with inducted receivers, but who played in a much more pass-happy era and had a tougher time standing out. A whole bunch of these players are now eligible for the Hall of Fame, and it's the selection committee's task to figure out which ones should be in. So with that in mind, let's enter two more names in conversation with Holt and Wayne, who first became eligible just this year, and each one has a pretty solid case too. When the expansion Houston Texans spawned into the NFL, the league didn't want a repeat of Carolina and Jacksonville a few years earlier and gave the Texans less draft capital to work with. So for years, Houston was bad, until eventually they graduated to subpar, then to mediocre, and finally by the early 2010s, they were an also-ran playoff team in a stacked AFC. Their lone star through almost all of this was Andre Johnson, one of two men, the other being J.J. Watt, with a legitimate claim as the face of the first 20 years of Texans football. Andre Johnson was not as durable as Reggie Wayne, but at his peak, oh my god, was he a monster. He was a first-team All-Pro for 3 consecutive years, leading the league in receptions and receiving yards twice each. He also posted almost 1,600 yards in 2012, which happened not to lead the league because it coincided with Calvin breaking the record, but was still an incredible output. I don't like to put too much stock into this because the methodology is weird and there's a lot of bias involved, but Andre's finishes in the annual top 100 player list speak volumes to how he was feared throughout the game. From 2008 to 2010, he was definitely the top receiver in football, and recognized as such, and that makes his case different from Wayne and Holt. Yet he still had enough volume to finish only one spot behind Wayne in both receptions and yards. This is a very compelling Hall of Fame case in its own right. And now we come to Steve Smith Sr., whose case is unusual in that it's hard to say whether he's a peak or longevity candidate, and it's also hard to call him just a receiver so much as a general weapon. He's a little ways down the list compared to Wayne, but he finished with more yards due to his penchant for the big play. Actually, Smith started as a kick and punt returner, and was so effective at that he earned a bigger role in the offense. In 2005, he posted a triple crown, leading all receivers in catches, yards, and touchdowns. But interestingly, he never led the league in any of those categories any other season. He was a 5-time Pro Bowler and a 2-time first-team All-Pro, but one of those was as a kick returner. I think Reggie Wayne was a more consistent and maybe slightly better pure receiver, but when you add in the role as a return specialist and the fact that Smith was a great playoff performer, I can absolutely see a strong case for Steve Smith as a Hall of Famer. The fact of the matter is, these 4 players are all extremely close to each other, and so who you vote for is a matter of what you value most. If you want the longevity consistency case, you vote for Reggie Wayne. If you want the guy who was widely considered the game's most dominant receiver for about a 3-year window, you vote for Andre Johnson. If you want a Swiss Army knife with the heart of a lion, you vote for Steve Smith Sr., and Torry Holt is somewhere in between, but every bit as qualified as the others. In Baseball Hall of Fame debates, when we have such conundrums, we can attempt to sort them out by using advanced statistics. In baseball, everything that happens can be turned into a stat one way or another, and so you can easily create a semi-objective methodology for player evaluation. It doesn't always work that easily. For instance, there are 3 different forms of WAR, and sometimes they disagree, such as this example featuring Turn of the Millennium center fielders, but this does allow fans to use more than just the eye test and the basic stats and accolades to evaluate players. I can think of at least 2 problems with trying to do similar things with football stats. The first one is scale. Even though they're the same thing in a way, there is a huge difference between leading baseball in runs scored and leading the NFL in touchdowns. The baseball player did that over 162 games, probably 600 plate appearances and 200 times on base or more. The football player did that over 16 games, now 17 as we head into 2022, and the difference between first place and 4th or 5th place could easily be 2 overthrows or a penalty or something silly like that. There is a degree of randomness to football leaderboards because you can't play as many games as you can in baseball. It would kill the players. The second and more obvious problem with football is that so much of what happens isn't reflected in statistics. The stats tell us who got the ball, how he got it, and how far he took it. But they don't do much to tell us how hard the other 10 players on his team fought to help him get that far. I've already talked about how the Hall of Fame monitor on Football Reference is kind of silly, and even more so is their WAR equivalent, the career approximate value, which puts Keenan McCardell ahead of Calvin. Among other things, it has multipliers for Pro Bowl and All-Pro selections, which themselves are subjective, and it really struggles to account for things like, in this case, receiver blocking ability. Just below our 4 receiver candidates, you can find 2 other guys who some fans might advocate as Hall of Famers. Those are Anquan Boldin and Hines Ward. I personally think they're a tier below the guys I mentioned, but that's just my opinion, and in the case of Ward in particular, it would be awesome to have some methodology to account for his blocking ability. But as far as I know, that doesn't really exist. That's an unfair problem for a player like him. Anyway, among receivers who played most of their careers in the period of time 2000 to 2015, we have already inducted Marvin Harrison, Randy Moss, Terrell Owens, Isaac Bruce, and Calvin Johnson. Bruce in particular does not have a stronger resume than the four candidates we've talked about, so his induction makes it difficult to justify those four guys not also getting in over the years to come. If that were to happen, though, there would be at least 9 Hall of Fame wide receivers from this period, and that's not counting Larry Fitzgerald, who will be voted in instantly as soon as he becomes eligible. This is a hypothetical scenario, of course, but if it happened, you'd have to think many fans would start asking whether the Hall of Fame was becoming the Hall of the Very Good. I took a look at the list of inducted receivers throughout history, and unless I'm not counting something correctly, I did find one comparable period in terms of volume. That's the late 60s, representing the later years of Barry, Allworth, Mitchell, McDonald, and Maynard, intersecting with the early years of Biletnikoff, Hayes, Taylor, and Warfield. Also, future Chargers great Charlie Joyner debuted with Houston in 1969. That's 10 names total, and there were fewer teams back then, even combining the NFL and AFL, so that bodes well for our protagonist. However, some of these players, specifically Mitchell and Taylor, were not strictly receivers, and some of them, especially Bob Hayes, have often been criticized as substandard selections. Reggie Wayne, Torry Holt, Andre Johnson, and Steve Smith all have way more receptions and receiving yards than every single one of those 60s and 70s receivers. Every era needs to have its own standards, and those standards need to be high. If they're telling us that 10 players from the same position from the same era are worthy, does that mean those standards aren't high enough? In this case, in my opinion, no. Wide receivers aren't quarterbacks, but they are important, and their importance has increased with time. More receivers see the field, more points are being scored, more plays are being run, and more of them are pass plays. This is the state of football today, and that means we have to reconsider the relative value of positions. Maybe it means running backs, who as we're learning don't matter as much as we once thought they did, need to stand out just a little bit more. It also means we should pay attention to, but definitely not rely on, the attempts of various statisticians to quantify the value of blockers and pass rushers. And finally, the NFL is huge, full of many players who come and go at many different positions. These guys were definitely elite players, and to me, there probably is room in the Hall of Fame for Reggie Wayne, and maybe even for Holt, Johnson, and Steve Smith Sr. too. This year, Wayne, Holt, and Johnson have all made it to the finalist stage, while Smith will have to wait for future opportunities. That doesn't spell doom for him or anything. The Pro Football Hall of Fame has many players and many positions to consider and can't induct more than 8 guys a year at the absolute maximum. For that reason, very few players get in on their first try, and it doesn't always make sense which ones do and which ones don't. With receivers, the committee has been stingy lately. They made both Harrison and T.O. wait several years as finalists, not to mention Chris Carter. For Wayne and Holt in particular, it will hurt them that they were teammates of Hall of Famers at the same position and that they generally weren't regarded as the very best in the league. But they were still really damn great, and I'd vote for them. And of course, I hope the selection committee feels the same way too. Hey, if you've stuck with me this whole way through, thanks so much for watching, really appreciate it. Sort of trying to grow this channel at this point. This is my 3rd video. I definitely have a focus in sports history and debates about the legacies of players, the halls of fame, also controversies around various sports and things like that. So if you have any ideas for future videos, I'm all ears. I do have a bunch lined up. Also, of course, as you can see, this is all the artwork that I made for this video, so I have a lot of fun doing that. And if you have any requests for any players that you want me to draw, you can hit me up on Twitter as well. Anyhow, thanks so much for watching. If you really like this video, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.